The flesh marks of political violence that scars us. Let us listen to these scars. My research examines sexual violence through performance art. I specifically analyze a piece by Tameka Norris, who's a Black performance artist of mixed race heritage. In her piece, Untitled, Norris commands the space of the gallery. She takes a knife. She slits her tongue with it. She then uses her bleeding tongue to slowly drag across the white gallery walls for 30 to 40 minutes on her hands and knees. Norris's work can be understood within a larger conversation of women of color performance artists and the work they produce to expose racial, gendered, and colonial violences. As Black women's bodies have historically been sites of rape and sexual violence in private and hidden spaces, my research interrogates how Tameka Norris contests this secrecy of violence committed within the private and hidden in her performance piece through the use of her blood and body and its inhabitation, exhibition, and control over a gallery space and audience. Norris disrupts the power dynamics of the gallery space through her body and blood, through the space she occupies, and through her gaze. Let's demonstrate. Norris wears a distressed red jumpsuit that's torn and tattered at the feet. She's wearing red nail polish and red bangles on both her hands, as if she's stained with the implications of the traits associated with the color red: passionate, sexual, dangerous, alarming. These traits can be traced back to a history of slavery and colonialism through which the Black woman has been constructed as hypersexual in order to justify the sexual violence routinely committed against her. By painting the white gallery walls with her own blood, Norris disrupts the assumed purity of this institutional space. She situates her intimate pain and secretions as woven into this very institution of whiteness, which has built itself upon the violent commodification of Black bodies. Through inviting an audience to watch and witness her wound herself, Tameka Norris quite literally reverses the power dynamics involved in traditional gallery spaces. Traditional gallery settings have typically contained Eurocentric high art and have historically been oppressive for Black bodies, forcing Black women and their body parts on display for viewer spectatorship. Norris inhabits an oppositional geography. This is a theory coined by Catherine McKittrick, who is a Black feminist geographer. We can understand oppositional geography as a contradictory space entailing both Black subjectivity and human terror and simultaneously Black resistance. So what does it mean for Norris to inhabit and occupy a space that has historically subjugated Black bodies? Norris demonstrates an incredible control over this gallery space and its audience. She circles the gallery about 3 times. Each time she physically displaces her audience, who has to move, reshift, and reorient themselves in order to make room for her. Norris performs a claim over the space, control over the audience, and agency over her body. And during key moments of her performance, Tameka Norris is looking back directly at her audience, enacting an oppositional gaze. Oppositional gaze is a concept theorized by bell hooks, a Black feminist scholar, to understand that there's a power associated with looking. Historically, white slave owners punished their slaves for even looking at them. This continued post-slavery through lynching. Lynching is used as a violent form of domestic terrorism that partly enacted this social control through controlling the gaze and suppressing it in Black bodies. Oppositional gaze is looking back to authority. Norris flips white spectatorship on its head by pulling the audience into a reenactment of violence. But she does something different that enslaved and lynched bodies were never allowed to do. She looks back without paying with her life. She embodies this position of her ancestors and also forces the audience to reenact positions of their ancestors, including the people of color in the audience, who can now bear witness and also look back. Time and space collapses on itself as Norris rewrites a history her ancestors were never afforded, imagining an alternate future and reality for Black liberation. Norris's performance offers us a glimpse of disrupting geographies of domination, contesting secrecies of violence committed within the private and hidden, claiming control over those spaces, and imagining futurities for Black liberation. Tameka Norris leaves her blood and wounds open for us if we dare to engage in such intimate insurgence against sexual violence. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any audience questions for Istifaa? Jenny?
Sorry to hog the mic, but yeah, the presentation was so fantastic and the paper is fantastic, and thank you so much for writing it and presenting it and for all the work that you've put in.
Okay, thank you for vouching for me.
So I was reminded of Claudia Rankine's recent play, The White Card, where she talks about a discussion happening between a black woman who is an artist and a white man who's her curator, who's funding the art. And in this play, they kind of have this conversation about whether the art that she's representing, in terms of because she's the artist in this play, is doing a lot of work to represent the suffering of black bodies, and whether she is curating this for this white lens that ultimately wants to envisage that suffering, ultimately wants to consume that in some ways. So I wondered if you could comment on sort of how the oppositional gaze can disrupt that as well, in terms of that discomfort, since Tameka Norris is performing violence in some instances on her own body, and the complications of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. I appreciate that question, because now we can more deeply have a conversation about gaze and spectatorship. Because while Tameka Norris is enacting an oppositional gaze, she's doing this in response to a theory that I coined as the white colonial gaze. This is a gaze that I'm defining as one that's obsessed with and fetishizes the torturing and suffering of bodies of color. And so this is the gaze that that I would argue has enacted a violence which produced these conditions of violence, of spectacularized black bodies consumed for entertainment through racialized and gendered forms of violence such as lynching. And this is reproduced in a lot of traditional art galleries and settings, through which a lot of black artists and performers who are invited are not done so to actually honor their agency and resistance, but it's more so consumed for white consumption and entertainment. Tameka Norris is flipping that on its head quite literally through enacting an oppositional gaze. Something that actually happens in her performance is halfway through, there's one white man in her audience He literally gets up and walks away from the performance. He leaves the crowd. And I feel like, call it speculation, but for me, it felt like denial on his part that she's able to claim this space and control over the audience and spectatorship. And the best part is that the black women in the audience were also looking back at him. So she invoked this power within her audience, specifically the black women in that audience, to also look back to him and assert their claim, control, and spectatorship over this gallery setting. Considering that Global UA is the world's leading research program, that I am an internationally recognized scholar, that this reaches across a global scale is incredible, because my work centers violence and resiliency of survivors and women of color. These are the types of knowledges and experiences that are consistently erased, devalued, and invisibilized in higher education and mainstream institutions. And for Global UA to recognize that means that I need to use my platform to center these experiences, to disrupt traditional modes of conducting research, of producing knowledge that's extremely individualistic, but to, again, center communal experiences, because the work that I produced is it's not an individual accomplishment. This is work that has been paved by previous scholars. I exist in a lineage of knowledge that was produced by women of color, by my foremothers who have passed down. So I exist in a transgenerational lineage of knowledge production that I'm essentially building off of and paving for future generations of marginalized scholars. I think something that I very much value about this space is the interdisciplinary nature of it. And so I have never been connected to hundreds of scholars from different institutions, walks of life, continents, backgrounds, etc., until I've attended this Global UA Summit. So this has been an amazing opportunity to not only network across these identities, but also be able to convey and legitimize my work in ways that are applicable to everyone else's experiences and work and practices as well. These are connections that we're making as a collaborative process. So part of why I value that this is an interdisciplinary department is because if we are so immersed into a single discipline, then it's impossible to be able to think outside of that. That's the problem I have with a lot of academia that's traditionally extremely disciplinary and rigid and strictly bound to those disciplines. But if we're so immersed in it, it becomes second nature to us that we're unable to think outside of that or tap into other approaches or solutions or experiences.